Something mysterious hides beneath an old oak in a quiet American town. What secret could drive a man to guard it for a lifetime? Stay with us until the end. The truth will shock you. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories like this. In the quiet town of Willow Creek, mornings always began the same way. The air smelled faintly of pine and rain, and mist rolled lazily across the open fields beyond the road. Among the rows of old wooden houses stood a small white cottage with green shutters and a sagging porch. It belonged to Harold Mason, a man who had lived there longer than most of the town's residents could remember. People said he had once been a soldier, but no one knew much about his life after he returned from the war. He kept to himself, spoke little, and seemed content to spend his days tending to his garden and sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee that always went cold before he drank it. But there was one thing that everyone in Willow Creek knew about Harold. In the middle of his backyard stood a massive oak tree, ancient and strong, with roots that twisted like old veins through the earth. Harold never let anyone come near it. When neighborhood children tossed a ball over his fence, he would return it without a word, his face tight and unreadable. The mailman once joked about cutting the tree down to open the view toward the hills, and Harold's expression turned so serious that the man never mentioned it again. The oak was sacred ground to him. Some evenings, when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the last light fell through the branches, neighbors would see Harold standing by the tree, his hand resting on its rough bark. Sometimes he would whisper something no one could hear, as if he were speaking to someone invisible. Others said he cried there when he thought no one was watching. Still, nobody ever dared to ask what made that tree so important. Everyone in Willow Creek understood that Harold Mason's silence was not to be disturbed. Inside his house, the walls were lined with dusty photographs, black and white images of a younger Harold in uniform, a medal pinned to his chest, his smile faint and uncertain. On the mantel stood a single-framed photo of a young woman named Ellen. Her eyes were bright and kind, the kind of eyes that made you feel safe. Harold would often glance at that picture before turning away, his jaw tightening. He never spoke her name to anyone, but the sadness in his gaze whenever he looked at her told the story without words. Over the years, Harold's body began to fail him. His back ached constantly, and his hands trembled when he tried to hold a cup. The doctors in town said it was a spinal tumor, and there wasn't much they could do. Harold accepted it quietly. He refused treatment beyond what was necessary, saying only that he had lived long enough. The few people who visited him said he seemed at peace, though his eyes grew distant, as if already halfway to another place. As autumn settled over Willow Creek, the great oak began to shed its leaves, covering the yard in gold. Harold spent one last afternoon sitting beneath it. He ran his fingers through the fallen leaves and looked up at the branches swaying in the wind. The neighbors saw him from afar, motionless, small beneath the massive tree. That night, his porch light stayed on longer than usual, flickering faintly against the darkness. When the next morning came, the light was still burning, but Harold Mason was gone. The news spread quietly. There was no drama, no scene of grief. The people of Willow Creek simply nodded to one another when they passed his house, as if they had always known this day would come. The town's pastor arranged a small funeral. A few veterans came, standing silently beside his coffin, their medals glinting in the sun. Afterward, the house was left locked and still, its windows gathering dust once again. A week later, a gray pickup truck pulled into the gravel driveway. The man who stepped out was Thomas Mason, Harold's younger brother. He hadn't seen Harold in years, not since a bitter argument after their mother's funeral. Life had taken Thomas elsewhere, to another state, another job, another family. Yet now, standing before the quiet house, he felt the weight of every unspoken word between them. The air smelled of old wood and rain, and the great oak towered over the yard, just as he remembered from childhood. Thomas unlocked the front door, and a rush of stale air greeted him. Inside, the house looked frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, faded curtains, the faint smell of coffee that had long gone cold. On the table lay Harold's reading glasses, folded neatly beside a half-finished crossword. Thomas wandered through each room slowly, feeling as though he were walking through a memory. He found the photograph of Ellen on the mantel and paused, remembering how Harold once mentioned her name only once, many years ago, before his voice broke and he changed the subject. As Thomas stepped into the backyard, the afternoon light broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the grass. The oak tree loomed before him, enormous and silent. Its bark was dark and thick, its roots curling deep into the ground like living chains. He remembered how Harold used to chase them away when they played near it as boys, yelling louder than he ever did for anything else. Back then, Thomas thought his brother was just being strange or controlling. But now, standing in the quiet yard, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The wind rustled the branches, and for a brief moment, Thomas imagined he could hear a whisper, a low, broken voice carried by the breeze. He shook his head, telling himself it was nothing. But as he turned to go back inside, he caught sight of a small plaque nailed to the tree's trunk. It was old, half covered in moss, and the letters were barely visible. He brushed the dirt away and read the faint inscription, M. 1969. Thomas frowned. He didn't remember ever seeing that before. Who or what was M? He looked back at the house, then at the tree, unease tightening in his chest. The silence of the yard pressed down on him, heavy and strange, as if the air itself was holding its breath. For the first time, he understood why Harold had never let anyone near it. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the yard. The shadow of the oak stretched long and dark across the grass. Somewhere deep inside him, something stirred, a mix of fear, sorrow, and curiosity. He didn't know it yet, but the secret his brother had guarded all his life was waiting beneath that tree, buried deeper than anyone could have imagined. And before long, it would change everything he thought he knew about Harold Mason, about his family, and about the man he once called simply brother. The morning light in Willow Creek was soft when Thomas Mason woke up in his brother's old house. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. The faint ticking of the clock and the smell of stale air brought him back. The room around him felt untouched, preserved as Harold had left it, as though his brother had simply stepped out and might return at any moment. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the sunlight filtering through faded curtains. Thomas sat up slowly, feeling the weight of silence that filled every corner. He had inherited the house now, though it didn't feel like his. It still belonged to Harold in every shadow and creak of the floorboards. He spent the morning walking through the rooms again, this time with more attention to detail. The kitchen was neat but outdated, the cupboards lined with cans and jars from years past. On the counter sat an old tin of coffee, nearly empty. In the living room, the photographs drew his eye once more. One in particular, a young Harold in uniform, smiling faintly beside a woman, made Thomas pause. He reached out and brushed a thumb over the glass. The woman's name came back to him slowly. Ellen. He had met her only once when he was a boy, and he remembered her laugh more than her face. It was a soft, comforting sound, the kind that could make a person forget the world for a moment. The longer he stayed in the house, the more Thomas felt Harold's presence pressing on him. It wasn't haunting. It was heavier, like unfinished business. In the bedroom closet, among folded shirts and a stack of old books, he found a box of letters tied with a piece of faded ribbon. Most were from fellow soldiers, some from their mother. The last few had no return address. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. He unfolded one and read only the first line before stopping. I'll be waiting, no matter how long it takes. His throat tightened. He put the letter back and closed the box gently. By afternoon, Thomas stepped outside into the yard. The wind moved through the grass with a faint whisper, and the oak tree towered in the center, its presence impossible to ignore. It looked older now, somehow darker, though the daylight was bright. He stood there a long time, remembering the summers of their childhood. Harold, tall and serious even as a teenager, always told them to stay away from the oak. Not here, he used to say, his tone sharp enough to end any argument. Thomas could still feel the sting of those words, the confusion and resentment they brought. He had never understood why his brother treated that tree like a sacred monument. Now, looking at it again, Thomas thought of how much space it took up in the yard. The thick roots cracked the soil. The branches stretched so wide they blocked half the sun. He imagined what the garden could be without it. A place for flowers, a bench, maybe a small pond. A new beginning. Yet he also felt the echo of Harold's voice in his mind, the silent warning that had kept everyone away for decades. He turned away, uneasy, then stopped. The house needed repairs. The roof leaked, and the yard was choked with weeds. He told himself it was just a tree, nothing more. Later that day, he called a local logging company. The man on the phone said they could send a crew in the morning. Thomas hesitated for a moment before agreeing, his voice quiet. That night, as he sat on the porch, the air grew cold and heavy. He could see the outline of the oak in the dark, massive and still. Somewhere inside him, a small flicker of doubt stirred, but he ignored it. The next morning came gray and windless. The sound of chainsaws cut through the quiet of Willow Creek. A group of workers arrived with trucks and ropes, their boots thudding across the grass. Thomas stood back as they prepared the site, tying ropes around the trunk. The air smelled of oil and fresh bark. He folded his arms, trying to convince himself he was doing the right thing. One of the men, a tall fellow with a calm voice, said, "That's a fine old tree, sir. You sure you want it gone?" Thomas nodded without answering. The first cuts into the wood echoed like heartbeats. Chips of bark scattered across the ground. The tree groaned as if alive, each creak deep and mournful. It took nearly an hour before it began to tilt, its roots straining, the ropes tightening as the crew shouted instructions. Thomas felt his stomach twist as the great oak shuddered, then fell with a thunderous crash that shook the ground. A cloud of dust and leaves rose into the air, the sound rolling through the quiet street like thunder. For a long moment, nobody moved. The men turned off their saws, breathing heavily. Thomas walked closer, stepping over broken branches. The trunk lay split and hollowed in parts, but there was nothing unusual inside. No markings, no hidden compartment, no secret that justified years of secrecy. It was just wood, lifeless and still. He felt a rush of disappointment mixed with guilt. Whatever meaning the tree had held for Harold, it was gone now, erased in an instant. When the crew left, Thomas remained in the yard. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale light on the fallen trunk. The space looked open and empty, almost too empty. For the first time since he arrived, the house seemed vulnerable, stripped of something invisible but essential. He stared at the stump that remained, the jagged surface rough and uneven. The silence around it was deep, almost unnatural. As evening approached, he walked around the stump one last time, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Something inside him felt unsettled, unfinished. He couldn't explain why. The wind had died completely, and the air felt heavy. He ran a hand along the rough bark and whispered, "I'm sorry, Harold." That night, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. He dreamed of the tree standing whole again, its branches twisting into shapes like reaching arms, and a figure standing beneath it. Harold, silent, his hand resting against the trunk. When Thomas woke, his heart was pounding, and the room was still dark. Outside, through the window, he could just make out the stump in the moonlight, a black shape against the pale ground. Something deep inside him told him this wasn't over. The secret his brother had guarded wasn't gone with the tree. It was still there, buried beneath the roots, waiting. The next morning broke with a low mist hanging over Willow Creek. The air was cool and damp, and the silence around Harold's old house felt heavier than ever. Thomas Mason stepped outside, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The stump of the fallen oak stood in the middle of the yard, surrounded by scattered branches and leaves that hadn't yet been cleared away. He stared at it for a long time, his hands deep in his coat pockets, and felt a strange pull in his chest. Something about the place unsettled him. It wasn't just the emptiness or the mess. It was the feeling that the yard itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. He had planned to start cleaning that morning, maybe call a landscaper to grind down the stump, but instead he found himself standing still, staring at it. The image of Harold's expression the last time they spoke came to him. Distant but sharp, his brother's cold, steady eyes, and the sound of his voice saying, "You don't understand, Tom. Some things aren't meant to be dug up." Thomas had dismissed those words as bitterness then. Now, with the great oak gone and the smell of freshly cut wood still in the air, they felt like a warning. He tried to push the thought away, telling himself he was being foolish. After all, it was just a tree. But as the morning dragged on, that sense of unease only grew. By noon, Thomas fetched a shovel from the shed. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more, just to see what lay beneath the roots. maybe to understand why Harold had been so protective of it. The ground was soft, easier to dig than he expected. The smell of damp soil filled the air, earthy and old. At first, he found nothing, just roots thick as his arm, winding through the dirt. Then, after several minutes, the shovel struck something solid. The sound was dull and heavy, not the clink of stone, but something man-made. Thomas froze for a moment, heart pounding, before kneeling down to clear the soil with his hands. Slowly, the edge of a black plastic sheet emerged from the dirt, its surface torn and worn with age. It looked out of place, unnatural among the roots. His fingers trembled as he brushed the dirt away. He hesitated, his breath coming shallow, then pulled the plastic open. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in an old military blanket. The sight stopped him cold. Carefully, he unwrapped the layers, revealing the dull metallic glint of an M16 rifle, rusted and caked with mud. Beside it lay a pair of grenades, corroded but unmistakably real. A few metal dog tags hung from a chain, tangled with the edge of a folded envelope. The name etched into the tags read Harold T. Mason. Thomas's throat tightened as he read it, his stomach twisting with disbelief. He sat back in the dirt, staring at the objects laid out before him. For a moment, he couldn't move. The sound of distant birds seemed far away, muffled, as if the world itself had dimmed around him. The realization came slowly, piece by piece. His brother had buried these things here himself, hiding them from the world, guarding them with that old oak as his silent sentinel. Thomas picked up the envelope, its paper yellowed and fragile. On the front, in faded ink, was a single word, Ellen. He hesitated again before opening it. Inside was a letter written in Harold's neat, deliberate handwriting. The words blurred at first, the letters swimming through tears he hadn't realized were falling. He wiped them away and forced himself to read. My dearest Ellen, it began. I don't know if this will ever reach you. The war ended, but something inside me didn't. I buried what I carried back because I couldn't look at it anymore. I can't forgive myself for coming home when you never got the chance to live the life we dreamed of. They say time heals, but time only hides the wound. The oak will guard this for me, for us. Maybe one day someone will find it and understand that I never stopped loving you. Thomas lowered the letter, his hands shaking. The quiet around him was absolute. He felt as if his brother's voice had spoken those words directly into his ears after his death. All the anger, the distance between them, the things left unsaid, it all broke open inside him like a flood. He realized now that Harold had spent the rest of his life trying to bury the war, to bury the pain, and perhaps even the guilt of surviving when others, including Ellen, hadn't. The oak hadn't been just a tree. It had been a gravestone for a life lost long before death took him. Thomas sat there until the light began to fade, his hands stained with earth. He knew what he had to do. He gathered the rifle and grenades carefully and placed them aside, covering them with a tarp until the authorities could come. But the letter and the dog tags he held close. They were not evidence. They were memory. They were love. When the police arrived later that evening, Thomas explained what he'd found. The officers were cautious, respectful. One of them, an older man with gray at his temples, nodded slowly as he examined the old weapons. Vietnam era, he said quietly. Your brother must have seen things he couldn't leave behind. Thomas only nodded. His voice failed him. They took the grenades away for safety, but they let him keep the letter and the tags. After they left, night fell over Willow Creek. Thomas sat on the porch, the cool wind brushing against his face. In his hands, he held the letter again, reading the final line over and over. The oak will guard this for me, for us. He looked out at the stump, now a dark shape against the moonlit yard. For the first time, he understood his brother's silence, the way he had built his life around that one sacred tree. Harold hadn't been hiding something shameful. He had been protecting the only thing that kept him connected to the person he loved most. Tears welled again, but this time they came with peace. Thomas looked up at the stars and whispered, I understand now, Harold. The air around him felt lighter, as though something unseen had finally been released. The tree was gone, the secret uncovered, but the memory it had guarded would live on, no longer buried in the ground, but in the heart of the only person left who could remember. The following days in Willow Creek passed with a quiet calm. The storm of discovery had settled, leaving only the soft echo of memory in its wake. Thomas Mason spent his mornings on the porch, sipping coffee from one of Harold's old mugs, his eyes wandering to the empty space in the yard where the great oak once stood. The stump remained for a while, a scar in the earth, dark and uneven. Every time Thomas looked at it, he felt a strange mix of grief and comfort, as if the ground itself still held the heartbeat of his brother's secrets. The police had confirmed what he already knew. The weapons were from the Vietnam era, rusted and long disarmed by time. They thanked him for handling it responsibly, promising to dispose of them safely. Thomas kept only two things, the letter and Harold's dog tags. They rested in a small wooden box on the mantel beside Ellen's photo. The house no longer felt like a stranger's place. Slowly, it began to feel like home. One evening, as the sun began to dip low behind the trees, Thomas walked out into the yard with a shovel in one hand and a small sapling in the other. It was a young oak, barely taller than his shoulders, its leaves bright and green. He had found it at the nursery on the edge of town and bought it without hesitation. The soil was cool beneath his boots as he knelt to dig, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel cutting through the quiet. When the hole was ready, he placed the sapling carefully into the earth, patting the soil around its roots. For a long moment, he stood looking down at it, his hand resting lightly on the tender trunk. In that stillness, he felt as though Harold was standing beside him, silent as ever, but peaceful now, free of the weight he had carried for so many years. Thomas went inside and came back with a small plaque he had carved himself. The letters were rough but clear. For Harold, you are finally home. He placed it beside the new tree and stepped back. The wind moved gently through the branches, making a soft rustling sound that reminded him of whispering. The air felt lighter than it had in months. It no longer carried the tension that had haunted the yard since the day the old oak fell. Instead, it was filled with something gentler, acceptance. Days turned into weeks. Thomas repaired the fence, cleaned the gutters, and painted the porch railings. The house, once heavy with silence, began to breathe again. Occasionally, neighbors stopped by to check on him, bringing pies or offering help with the yard. Most of them had known Harold only as a quiet, distant man, but now they spoke of him differently. They listened to Thomas when he told them about the letter, about Ellen, about how his brother had carried the past like a wound he never allowed to heal. For the first time, people in Willow Creek seemed to understand Harold Mason. He was no longer the strange recluse who guarded a tree. He was a man who had loved too deeply, fought too hard, and found peace only in the soil beneath his own home. On one of the first warm evenings of spring, Thomas sat on the porch again, watching the young oak swaying in the soft breeze. Its leaves shimmered in the golden light, alive with promise. He thought about the war that had taken so much from his brother, about the woman whose photograph still smiled from the mantel, and about how life, in its quiet way, always finds a way to grow again. He took out Harold's dog tags from his pocket and turned them over in his hand. The metal was cool against his skin, the engraving faint but still legible. For a moment, he pressed them to his heart, then looked up at the darkening sky. "You can rest now, brother," he whispered. "You kept your promise." The wind rose gently, passing through the leaves of the young oak, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain. Thomas could almost imagine the sound of footsteps behind him, the familiar creak of Harold's boots on the porch, the quiet sigh of contentment that had eluded him in life. The thought brought no fear, only warmth. He smiled, the kind of small, honest smile that comes from knowing something has finally been set right. As night fell, the stars came out one by one, scattered across the deep blue sky. The house stood still and peaceful, the soft glow from the porch light spilling across the yard. The new tree swayed gently, its branches catching the light as though it were breathing. Thomas watched until the air grew cool and the first fireflies appeared. Then he whispered a final good night, turned off the porch light, and went inside. From the window, the oak was just a shadow against the moonlit grass, fragile yet strong, rooted in the same ground that had once held so much sorrow. It stood as a symbol of everything Harold had buried and everything Thomas had unearthed, not to destroy, but to understand. The past no longer haunted the place. It lived quietly within it, part of the soil, part of the tree, part of the man who remained. And as the night deepened over Willow Creek, A soft wind moved through the leaves, as if carrying a voice too gentle to hear, a whisper of peace that drifted into the stars. Sometimes healing doesn't come from forgetting, Thomas thought as he closed his eyes. It comes from planting something new in the place where pain once grew. And in that quiet, infinite moment, both brothers finally found rest. The secret is finally revealed, but some truths remain buried deeper than we imagine. If this story kept you watching, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. More untold stories are on the way.